Good afternoon and thanks for joining. It's a new day and another chance to get things going your way. On today's show, we'll be discussing the Real House of Atlanta physical confrontation between stars Portia Stewart and Kenya Moore, which demonstrated a bullying target's limits after being chastised a bit too long. After that, we have Underground Railroad's master quilter, Sharon Tindall. Then we'll have our quote of the day. So starting with our discussion on the Real House of Atlanta, that was an incredible situation in which two stars entered into a physical confrontation just because one didn't understand when to take a break. Anytime anyone enters into a physical confrontation, it's never acceptable. And it's never acceptable to use physical violence to resolve any conflicts. The Real Housewives of Atlanta incident between these two stars, Portia Stewart and Kenya Moore, demonstrated the effect of workplace bullying and the potential negative impacts of letting it go unresolved. So let's start with some of the discussion points or some details from the incident. Well, first, we've got to realize that bullying can be a single or it can be multiple incidents. So a lot of times folks believe that bullying has to do with multiple incidents that occur over a period of time. Well, no, there can be one incident that is just so egregious that bullying can occur just in that one incident alone. The other thing is that I've heard a lot of folks say is that bullying is about someone being weaker. And bullying is not necessarily about someone being weaker than another. It's more about an individual using their power, influence, and control to harass, intimidate, and threaten another. And that's exactly what Kenya Moore did in this particular incident on the Real Housewives of Atlanta reunion. Also, when we look at the actions of Kenya Moore, we see that she used a lot of props and other situations to provoke not just Portia, but she had also provoked others on the show at various points. So what actually transpired on the reunion show was that Kenya actually pushed things to the limit when she started pointing a scepter towards Portia during discussions and then later using a bullhorn to speak to Portia, who was just a few feet away. And given their past history, and I'm not condoning the actions that Portia took, but given their past history and then the ongoing escalation of the tactics that Kenya was using, Portia had just had enough at that point. And unfortunately, the two eventually entered into each other's space until Portia started feeling pushed just a little bit too far, and her anxieties or stress of the situation got to her, and then she began to pull at Kenya Moore's hair, and then unfortunately both of them ended up falling to the floor, and it was an embarrassing situation for all of the parties involved. And you know, it's important for me to stop and say that violence is never the answer to resolve an issue or a situation, and it's unfortunate that that these two stars had to end up at this particular place in their confrontation. So what were some of the key issues that happened? Well, Portia and Kenya had a history of escalating conflict. So that was a potential warning sign that things were happening. And then as the taunting continued by Kenya on the show, there was clearly an escalation on Portia's part in terms of her reaction to the situation. So one of the first signs that something was really, really bothering Portia is when she grabbed the scepter out of Kenya's hand and then threw it aggressively on the floor. That should have been a clear sign to those that were watching and observing this to say, you know, something is probably not right here, and maybe we should take some actions to sort of cool off the situation. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. And then as we continue to watch the situation continue to escalate, immediate action should have been taken to reduce the conflict from further escalation. But again, no one took action to resolve anything, including the leader of the situation, Andy Cohen, who didn't demonstrate any leadership at all by trying to defuse the situation, protect the resources that were involved, or try to do anything to resolve the situation prior to it getting out of control. And that's the unfortunate part of this, is that there were multiple opportunities to prevent this particular issue to be resolved prior to, or if not resolved completely, at least to allow things to calm down a little bit by taking time, distance, space, whatever, to prevent this particular issue from escalating too far. So what are some of the lessons that we can take away from this particular incident? Well, first and foremost, there should be an attempt to resolve conflicts between the parties as quickly as possible. Sometimes when things are starting to escalate and getting out of control, sometimes the best thing to do, instead of continuing the discussion, is to just take a time out, take a pause, walk away, and allow yourself to collect yourself, reduce the stress of the situation, and then come back to the situation a little bit later when it's a little bit cooler, and so that folks aren't continuing to escalate the situation. The other thing is when outside observers are in a situation, they can also be part of the resolution process by trying to take action to reduce the escalation before it gets to a place where there's a violent confrontation. And if it's safe to do so, get involved. We don't want anybody else to get hurt by a particular incident that's escalating out of control, but to the extent possible, we've got to take corrective action as quickly as possible to prevent things from continuing to escalate and spiral out of control. Also, we need to make sure that efforts should be made to separate these individuals via time and distance and to assist in the resolution of any conflict at the time the conflict is not at a heightened state. So again, separating by time, distance, space, and then allowing individuals to cool off and then coming back and then having discussions later when folks aren't as angry or as heightened by the situation. And then don't wait until the situation has erupted to take action. We've got to take action early in the process to prevent individuals from getting to that point where they do something that they regret. And then one of the most important things in any type of bullying situation, especially when leaders are involved, is that the leaders must take ownership of the situation. They have to demonstrate leadership by making sure that the resources that are under their purview are not continuing to escalate the situation, taking action to diffuse the anger, the animosity, or anything else to resolve the issue at hand. But most importantly, a leader must take action to protect its resources long before a conflict knowingly escalates. But those were just some of my thoughts on the Real Housewives of Atlanta, because we're seeing a lot of topics in the news, in the media today about ongoing bullying incidents. But a lot of times bullying incidents can be resolved long before they get to a point where they get out of control by taking action early on in the process to make sure that individuals are aware of any type of issues or behavior or actions that are inappropriate and dealing with them as soon as possible to prevent anyone from getting into a uncomfortable, unwanted, or unprovoked situation. So after the break, we're going to continue on with our discussion. Today, we're going to have our guest on to discuss the master quilting that went on during the Underground Railroad. So we'll be back right after this break. Welcome back, and I'm excited to interview someone who has a history like not many others. It's an important skill, valuable knowledge, and history that must be captured. Let's welcome our guest, Sharon Tindall, Master Quilter for Underground Railroad Quilt Codes. Welcome, Sharon.
Hi, and thank you for having me.
Well, I'm excited to interview you today because this is an important topic, and not a lot of folks know a lot about it. So what got you started quilting?
Well, what got me started quilting, I have a history of sewing. I am a seamstress, and I've been sewing for many, many years. And I decided at one point I was depressed. I wasn't working. So I decided to take some scrap fabric and make a quilt for myself and my son and a couple friends. That's how I got started.
So it sounds like it was something that was very therapeutic for you.
Yes. Sewing has always been therapeutic for me.
So going from that depression and doing something that was therapeutic to sort of relieve some of that depression and stress, how did it turn into what you're doing now as it relates to the Underground Railroad and quilting?
I have two sons, and one of my sons needed some help with a history project, which was about slavery and the Underground Railroad. So I took that knowledge that I had, did some research, and discovered that there was such a thing called quilt codes. Some researchers believe that it is not true, but I've come to learn that it is.
So tell me a little bit about your research. So how did you validate that quilt codes is something that folks actually used in the days of slavery?
My trip to Liberia, West Africa, last summer.
Okay.
And I learned many things. One is that codes were put into fabric. I'm not going to go into too much detail about it, but I have the proof that the quilt codes are true. And there's many things designed into each quilt block, a name, geometric designs, and it actually helped people, the slaves in general, move from one part of the country to another. They had something that was born in them that they're not going to forget, and they kept it as a secret for us, but it wasn't really a secret for them because a lot of the knowledge that they had, they passed down from generation to generation, and they didn't write it down. But I'm here to tell you that there is a code, it is true, and it did help slaves get from one area to another.
So let's discuss that a little bit further. So they have these quilts out. They're out in plain view and in plain sight. So how is it that a slave understood the code? So what is it that they were looking for in these quilts?
The geometric design.
Okay.
And let's take, for example, the quilt block named the Drunkard's Path. The Drunkard's Path is also Solomon's Puzzle. Depending on what part of Africa you came from, and we're just going to say West Africa because I've been there, the quilt design is in circles and it looks like a path. And the message in that quilt block is, follow the path by the river like a drunkard so you won't get caught. You want to go north. There's also a quilt block called the North Star. The North Star directs you into the way, the path that is north. There's also another one called Flying Geese. Flying Geese, you'll always see with the North Star. It's giving direction. We often talk about the colors that are used. The colors that are used in quilt blocks at that time period would tell, they have different meanings, and they would tell the slaves there's a code within that color within that block.
And that's how they figured out what direction they needed to go in, whether they were in safe territory or not, and a lot of other communication. Well, I think that's some great information, but why don't we take a break for right now, and we'll be back in just a moment to continue our discussion with Sharon Tindall, Master Quilter. All right, welcome back. We're continuing our discussion with Sharon Tindall, Master Quilter for Underground Railroad Quilt Codes. So, Sharon, before the break, what we were talking about were some of the symbols that are contained within some of the quilts. And we're fortunate enough to have some of the quilts in studio with us today. So why don't we look at the quilt that we have in front of us right now? So there looks like there's at least 5 different squares, and it has a lot of different symbols and designs in it. So why don't you walk us through some of the things that are shown here?
Okay, let's start with the North Star. We have the North Star. We have Flying Geese. We have Charm, the Drunkard's Path, and Catch Me If You Can. The North Star is in connection with the Flying Geese, which is telling the person or people to go north.
Okay.
This particular one is dark. You would see the stars in the navy blue, and you would see the red. And the colors each have their own meaning. Then you see the Flying Geese. You see Charm. Charm means don't forget your African tradition.
Okay, so maintaining that legacy.
Correct. Then we have the Drunkard's Path, which is in navy blue. So you're going to follow the path by the river like a drunkard. And you're going to go north, and you're going to follow the geese north because the geese fly north.
And just real quick, you've referred a couple of times to this drunkard. Follow the path like a drunkard. What does that mean, being a drunkard?
It means don't follow a straight path.
Okay.
Follow a crooked path.
Gotcha.
And then the one in the middle is Catch Me If You Can, and it is just what it says. Catch me if you can.
So what's the significance of the slaves that are going through the underground or using the Underground Railroad of following a crooked path versus a straight path?
So they won't get caught.
Okay, so it's making sure that they're not following a straight direction, that it's easy for them to follow, and
Correct.
Maybe also when they're having dogs tracking them and scent, just to sort of keep them off that straight
Correct.
trail.
And then if they're following, and if they're being followed, the people that's following the slave, they're going to see that they're not following the path straight, that it is crooked, and maybe they are drunk.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, there's a little bit of strategy in there as well inside of the quilt codes. And then there's a couple of more.
Charm means do not forget your African tradition, your heritage. Don't forget it. And Catch Me If You Can is just that. Catch
Okay.
me if you can, while I follow the path like a drunkard north by following the geese to the stars.
And then, so once they make these quilts, are they just they reuse these quilts over and over again, or do they
Absolutely.
create new ones depending on new information?
They would usually, from my understanding, they would recreate the same quilt and use that one, pass it along to someone else, and then someone would make a new one with a different code. This one tells you to go north. There's another one that says watch your back, or another one, the monkey wrench. It tells you to get your tools together because you're going on a trip. There's another one called bow ties. Bow ties tells you to get dressed in your best clothes because you're going to meet a conductor on the train, and he will help you get to safety.
So when these quilts are out on display, is there typically one quilt that's out on display, or are there a couple of quilts that are displayed at the same time to provide a lot of valuable information all at once? So how does it actually work? So do I just see one quilt, a bunch of quilts, or do I see one quilt here and then I head down the river or down the trail a little bit further and then I see another quilt?
That is typically what I've learned. You have one quilt at one safe house run by the Quakers, and then maybe 3 or 4 miles down the road you find another one that says something different. Yes, that's correct.
All right. Well, there's a lot of great information that's contained in this quilt, and I know that you have a couple more, and I think we're going to have time to at least discuss one more today.
Okay.
So we'll continue our discussion right after the break. All right, and welcome back. We are continuing our discussion with Sharon Tindall, Master Quilter for Underground Railroad Quilt Codes. And earlier we were discussing one of the quilts that's used or were used during the or types of quilts that were used during the slave days, and now we're looking at another one, and this one's quite interesting, and it's really different than the last one that we looked at, in that this one looks sort of like it's a combination of a couple of different flags, and then it has a bunch of names and terms on it, and these names and terms don't necessarily look like they should belong together, including the look of the flag. So tell us a little bit about this.
This is my rendition of a Union and Confederate flag.
Okay.
My son and 2 of his friends were over our house, and it was a snow day. I want to get working on this, and they're just being teenagers. So I asked each of them to give me 3 names and tell me about them, 3 names connected with the Civil War. So they did. So they actually learned something, and I embroidered the names and or places that are connected with the Civil War on the Union and Confederate flag.
All right, well, let's start with the flags, themselves. So where did you find these flags to begin this quilting project?
Somewhere in my brain.
Okay.
It just kind of came. I wanted to do this, and it took me a while to figure out how I was going to do it, but I did. And then I wanted to do it and get it done, and then the boys came over, and they helped me.
Okay, so these aren't pieces of original flags.
No.
These are recreations of what the flags might have looked like or represented during that time.
Correct.
And then you brought it all together to bring out a concept similar to what might have been represented during slave time, or is this more of a historical perspective?
This one is more of historical perspective.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about what we're seeing.
It is a flag that I created. It is navy blue with some white stars on it, and then it's got some white checks on it, and then it's got what could be a K, depending on where you are from and what your thoughts are. And then we just embroider different things on it connected with the Civil War, such as Bull Run, Fort Sumter, the Underground Railroad, the Emancipation Proclamation, John Brown, Robert E. Lee, just to name a few.
Okay, so there's a lot of different names. I mean, some very prominent names: Abraham Lincoln, obviously, Frederick Douglass. I see a representation of the U.S. colored troops, slavery, anti-slavery, and abolitionists. So there's a lot of different terms. So why is this particular piece significant for you, that you're like, you know what, I need to do something that represents both flags. I need to do something that represents all these different terminology. What's the message that someone who's looking at this, that, in some ways, not that it's real overwhelming, but when you see a lot of information like this that's gathered together, it can be sort of challenging sometimes for your mind to put it all together and associate meaning, especially when you add the words that you've included in here. So tell us what message we should take away, or what message would you like us to at least have in our minds while we look at this?
When you look at this, many things can be thought, and many things usually are thought. My thought in doing this, and including all of the names, you can't do it by yourself. Mm-hmm. You know, we are blessed to be able to do this, to have these names, and each person represented on this flag contributed to American history.
So regardless of what side they were on, as it relates to slavery, there's a lot of history, there's a lot of value in understanding the story, and that we need to continue to understand the things that happen so that we make sure that we don't get into those situations again, I would take it.
Absolutely.
All right, great. Well, thank you very much, and we're going to take one more break, and then we'll come back and get some parting thoughts from Sharon.
Okay.
And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, and we're continuing our discussion with Sharon Tindall, Master Quilter for Underground Railroad Quilt Codes. So, Sharon, you have shared so much valuable information. I mean, I didn't know anything about any of this prior to our conversation today, so I really appreciate you taking a lot of time to share this information with me and our listeners. So, is there anything else that you'd like to tell us as we start to wrap up our conversation today?
Each one teach one. And everybody has a story. Write it down. Mm-hmm. You know, it tells us in Habakkuk 2 in the Bible, whatever your story is, whatever your vision is, to write it down. Mm-hmm. And at the appointed time, God will make it come, whatever it is. And sometimes we don't realize where our blessings come from, mm-hmm. and who gave us the vision in the first place. We have to go through some things as our ancestors did. We have to go through for maybe, if not for ourselves, but for the next generation. Share what you have, and God will bless you with the rest.
You know, I think that's a great message. You know, one of the things I also like to say is that sometimes we do things when we've allocated, when the time is allocated, versus doing something when our mind is dedicated. And sometimes when we have these little seeds that are planted in our minds and information that we can share, there's a lot of value in sharing this because it's part of our collective experiences, yes, that drives us forward, right?
Yes. And I didn't know a month ago half the information that I know today because someone thought enough of me to share it with me. Mm-hmm. So my way of sharing with you and whoever listens or whoever sees a quilt, there's some history there. Mm-hmm. Take time, look at it, because we're all visual learners. Look at it, appreciate it, and know your own history.
Yeah, and there's a lot of value when we share our life lessons and let others know about the things that we're working on, because sometimes others have information that we would have never even have realized had we not shared that information in the first place. So what about displaying your quilts? Are your quilts on display anywhere?
Not currently, but I am planning to have them on display at the Manassas Museum in August.
Okay, well, as you get more information on having your quilts displayed there or anywhere else, just let me know and I'll get the information updated on my website. But Sharon, I'd like to thank you so much for coming in today. I really enjoyed the conversation. I think a lot of folks are going to benefit and be really curious about this critical part of our history.
And that's good. And I'm happy to share. Your viewers, your listeners can email you and you can get in contact with me. It'll be great.
All right. Well, thanks again, Sharon, for coming in. So today we've been having a conversation with Sharon Tindall, Master Quilter for Underground Railroad Quilt Codes. It was a great discussion. I learned a lot, and hopefully you did too. Everyone, we'll talk to you in a little bit after the break. Welcome back. It's now time for my quote of the day. This is a quote I wrote probably about 6 months ago, and it's one of my favorites. You can't be anything you want, but you can work towards anything you want. Then, if you fall short of your goal, there's still value in the journey. You know, throughout our youth and as we were growing up, we've been told, and maybe even through our adult life, we've been told, you can be anything that you want to be. Well, I'm here to tell you, you can't be anything that you want to be, but what you can do is work towards anything that you want. And even if you don't achieve your goal, there's still a lot of value in going through the process, because whatever you learn while you're pursuing your goal, your objective, or just a short-term task that you're working on, there's always something that can be learned from it, even if it doesn't lead to what you set out to do in the first place. So remember, there's always value in everything that we do. If we're taking positive steps forward, it's something that's going to help us to continue to move forward on our life's journey. And we might not be able to use that information today, but it's something that could probably help us sometime in the future, because there's a lot of times where I've had an idea or I've done something and I said, you know what, that's not something that is something that I can use today, or no, that's not something that I can use at all, and I just go ahead and get rid of it, or that's something that I can use immediately. But the things that I can't use right now, what I do is I store it away. I call it planting a seed, and then I put it inside and just let it sit there. And then sometime in the future, when I'm doing something, all of a sudden I'll go, oh my, you know what? I had an idea earlier, and then I go back to that seed that I planted earlier. And then what I do is then I implement that seed at the proper time, because sometimes we get ideas that come into our heads and we're like, oh man, I don't know what to do with that. Well, don't discard it necessarily, but, hold on to it. And there might be a time in the future when you'll realize why that seed was important. And then at that time, what you can do is you can start working towards that goal or using it to further your agenda, whatever it is at that particular point in time. So I hope that everybody has enjoyed today's show, because it was another exciting day on the show. Remember, if it's a new day, it's another chance to get things going your way. So keep moving forward to achieve your dreams and make this day even better than yesterday. Have a great day, everyone, and look forward to talking to you on our next show. Take care.